Well, hello everyone. My name's Yukio Lippit, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Arts at the Radcliffe Institute. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this occasion. The opening of the exhibition by Wendy Jacob, titled Calm, Smoke Rises Vertically, in Radcliffe's Johnson-Kulukundis Family Gallery. Now, Wendy Jacob is a widely admired artist who bridges many practices, among them the practices of architecture, sculpture, design, invention. She was based in Chicago for many years, where she received her master's MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago, and where she was a founding member of the art collective HaHa that was formed there in 1988 and worked together for some 2 decades. HaHa is widely acclaimed for developing an art practice that really pushed at many of the boundaries of what art could be and who had access to it. Its many projects, which included all kinds of community-based projects, sculptural installations, video work, and so forth, tended, in their words, to be ephemeral, closely interwoven with the times and places where they were shown, and addressed the particulars of living in a locally and sensually embedded situation. Now, in addition to her work with HaHa, Jacob also developed her own artistic projects that explored, among other things, the relationships between architecture and perceptual experience, the interface between architecture and the bodies of the peoples and animals inhabiting the built environment. And in this regard, Jacob has been the consummate collaborator who's worked in a collective with other artists, but also with architects, engineers, researchers in various fields over the years, really yielding a long list of solo exhibitions, publications, and residencies, nationally and internationally, too numerous to enumerate here, although I'd be remiss not to mention that she was formerly a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute in the year 2005. One of her more well-known collaborations was with Temple Grandin, the animal scientist who has written widely on autism. And catalyzed by conversations with Grandin, Jacob developed the squeeze chair, which consists of an upholstered chair, a series of chairs really, with arms that inflate to hold the sitter in a firm hug. It takes its cue from the fact that many with autism are especially receptive to the calming effects of pressure. In 2006, Jacob founded the Autism Studio at MIT, a multidisciplinary studio that aims to explore perceptual features afforded by the broad range of autistic experience, and to create objects and spaces and events that really resonated with these experiences. More recently, over the past 2 years, Jacob has worked with the Cherry Road Resource Centre for the Disabled in Scotland to understand, among other things, the nature of the tactility of sound for the hearing impaired. Now, the exhibition that opens today, Calm, Smoke Rises Vertically, really extends in new ways the vectors of inquiry that Jacob has been pursuing over the years, most notably her interest in expanding the sensory dimensions of art. In the Johnson-Kulukundis gallery, 10 architectural models are displayed in combination with meteorological information, which is played through the walls of the gallery. And both the models and the weather reports convey empirical knowledge that by calibrating verbal description to sensory experience. The architectural models displayed in the gallery are on loan from the Perkins School for the Blind and the Ohio State School for the Blind. They have an interesting history. They were created between the years 1935 and 1943 under the auspices of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which mobilized many craftsmen and specialists to create tactile models for blind students. The models were intended to convey knowledge about architecture through touch, allowing blind students to see them for the first time. The weather reports, which are conveyed through the walls, include a live streaming of the weather broadcast of the NOAA, also live sounds from outdoors, and a reading of the Beaufort wind scale. The Beaufort wind scale is a scale that was developed in the early 19th century to match a defined set of verbal descriptions to approximate wind speeds, with the practical aim of allowing users to, on land or sea, to quantify the observable conditions around them. And so, for example, a 4 on the Beaufort scale, which is a brisk breeze, is indicated by the phrase, "small trees and leaf begin to sway." So the title of the exhibition, Calm, Smoke Rises Vertically, describes a wind speed of less than 1 knot. Now, the exhibition highlights in a wonderful way the correspondences between the tactile models and weather reports in order to underscore the ways in which perceptual experiences through different senses reinforce and transform one another. In the models, touching is synonymous with seeing, whereas in the weather reports, the invisible, the wind, is rendered comprehensible. And by playing the weather reports through the walls of the gallery, Jacob, in essence, transforms the gallery walls themselves into large surfaces of sound, speakers of sound, thus generating an equivalence, again, between tactility, between its tactility and that of the models. Now, although we live in an age of the lab, the model, it seems, for all forms of innovative research, especially at a university, including artistic research, one might say that Wendy Jacob is an artist of a different kind, one who belongs to something like the club, fundamentally collaborative and egalitarian, as suggested by one of her recent projects, the Explorers Club. Her work is characterized by a great deal of empathy, but not necessarily only for the so-called disabled peoples and communities with whom she works, but really her empathy is directed at the rest of humanity, which is missing out on so much rich sensation and attunement to one's surroundings. In her interdisciplinary approach and relentless plumbing of different spheres of knowing, her aims seem to resonate so well with the aims of the Radcliffe Institute as a whole, and it is a real privilege to be able to work with her on this occasion. Now, this exhibition was organized by the Academic Ventures Division of the Radcliffe Institute in conjunction with the Radcliffe Arts Program. And on behalf of our Dean, Liz Cohen, our Director of the Academic Ventures, Becky Wasserman, Jennifer Burkett, and others at Academic Ventures, Meg Rotzel, our Arts Program Manager, Joe Zane, our Preparator, and our colleagues in Facilities, Communications, Events, the Fellows Program, I'd like to say a few thank yous. And we'd like to convey heartfelt thanks to the Perkins School for the Blind, and in particular to Betsy Sennett, the curator of the Tactile Museum there, who was a really generous collaborator and helped enable this exhibition and the loans to our gallery, as well as the Ohio State School for the Blind and Cecilia Perrano and Laurie Kaplan there. They, again, greeted this project with so much support and enthusiasm. We'd also like to thank our friends at the National Braille Press, and also to thank Lily Shirless, who was an undergraduate at Harvard College who served as Wendy's assistant, and whose competence and formidable research skills were also essential in enabling the show. Last but not least, we'd like to thank Wendy Jacob herself, a collaborator in the true sense of the word, and an artist who has taught us a great deal, someone who's kind of constantly full of remarkable observations that make you see daily life around you in new and meaningful ways. Now, for our panel discussion, in addition to the artist herself, we'll be joined by Hansel Bauman, who is practicing architect and founding partner of Hansel Bauman Architect and Planner, as well as university architect and executive director of campus design and construction at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. In 2006, he founded the DeafSpace project, which is he's a recognized leader in architectural design that enhances cultural and sensory experiences, and was lectured and published widely on architecture, the senses, and disabilities, and was a 2015 recipient of the Gold Award from the International Association of Universal Design. Our other panelist is Kim Charlson, who has been the director of the library at the Perkins School for the Blind since 2001. She is a distinguished expert on library and information services for people with disabilities. Charlson is widely published and serves on several committees for the Library of Congress's National Library Service and for the blind and physically handicapped. She is the first woman president of the American Council of the Blind. It's hard to think of two more distinguished interlocutors to discuss our exhibition today, so please join me in welcoming them now.
Thank you, Yukio. I just wanted to add a few thank yous of my own. And I wanted, in addition to Yukio, who's been just really wonderful to work with, and Rebecca, and Jennifer Burkett, and Meg Rotzel, who's the gallery director, who has also spent hours cleaning these models with a Q-tip. And Joe Zane, who excavated the gallery walls to install the transducers inside them. And again, Lily Shirless, the excellent research assistant. And the graduate students, Georgia Kanichi and Kyoto Koseki and Faith McClure, who also spent long, patient hours cleaning with Q-tips. And Virat Shukla and Will Mentor for help with production of the model. And Beth and Cecilia Perano, who came here from Ohio. And finally, I want to express my appreciation to all of the unknown craftsmen of the WPA era who produced these models, and for the statesmen and stateswomen of that progressive era who had the vision to commission them.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. Many times, Wendy, during the preparations for the show, you've mentioned that you've really taken some of your cues for this project and for your kind of vectors of inquiry in general from the architecture for the Perkins School for the Blind, which is just next door in Watertown, Mass. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit upon what it is about the architecture and the environment there that has been so catalytic for you.
I think this is something that the three of us share. I think 4 years ago, Hansel and I took a tour of the Perkins School in Watertown. And what I think most amazed us is the old building, the old Victorian buildings, where they're really built to give you a sense of where you are in space. And for example, the floors are tiled, but when you hit a cross section, the ceiling's higher, and so the echo of your footfall changes, and so you know that you've hit an intersection. And one of the most beautiful and subtle aspects of it is that the floors are slightly tilted. I mean, really very slightly tilted, so that if you're walking against the tilt, you know you're going on a straight line. But if you start to go uphill or downhill, you're zigzag. And when we were there, we went into the basement where we discovered this amazing collection of tactile objects, which included the buildings, some of which are here, but it also includes like a taxidermied shark and a bear and a rocket ship. And
What a sight.
It's like a cabinet of curiosities, really.
Well, yeah, I guess on that same tour, to me, I think kind of seeing that building through Wendy's eyes was very, really quite an experience, because I think it was intentionally designed acoustically, like Wendy's explained. But I think there was also another layer of design about that building that I think we often forget, that really started me thinking about the idea of materiality. Because it's a stone collegiate Gothic building that not only do you begin to have the kind of resonance from acoustics from that stone, but you could almost begin to feel pressure from it. Like the weight of the wall in that space, you could really begin to sense the difference of if a wood wall is next to you, or if a heavy stone wall is next to you, or because of the vibration, you could really begin to tell the scale of the space. So there's really, that building really, in some ways, reached out and touched you in a way that I don't think I've ever experienced in a building before. For me, that opens up a whole new question about how we really do experience space, far beyond our obsession as architects is what they look like.
So I have the opportunity to work with these folks and be a part of this panel. And one of the joys about doing this is because I walk through those halls every day, and sometimes I don't think about what they really mean, and to talk to Wendy and Hansel and about how much they gained from walking in the halls of the Howe building at Perkins, really made me appreciate them and kind of go back and think about, well, these are the halls I walk all the time, but what do they mean? And they do have sensory meaning, and they really do bring out what I think is a often underutilized sense for blind and visually impaired people, which is really kind of feeling and communing with the building you're in. And it sounds a little woohoo, to talk about something like this, but in fact, you may, just think about it yourselves. You may have been in a building where part of it felt really cold, but then you might be walking down the hall and there's other parts that are warm, or that sound from the high ceiling to the more tightly closed or the wooden walls. You can pick up so many cues and so many clues from the building itself. And I think that's what's really exciting about Wendy's work and the whole idea of thinking about buildings as places that are communicating to you as well and delivering a message. The Perkins buildings are, they're symmetrical on both sides. So back in the day when they were built in the 1912 or so, they had a side for girls and a side for boys. And so everything is identical on both sides. So it's, and it was very thoughtfully designed that way, but there are so many clues. And I think one thing, when you experience the exhibit today, the one thing that you really need to put aside is that old mantra of do not touch, because this is an exhibit where you're really encouraged to touch and to feel the smoothness and the roughness or whatever in the models that you're looking at. So it's a multisensory experience that I think will be just fascinating and really inspiring for all of you to take full advantage of.
Yeah, could we talk a little bit more about this idea of kind of tactile engagement with your surroundings and with objects and ways of acquiring knowledge about them? Because that is something that there is a kind of, very strong, I think, inhibition against doing once you enter a gallery or museum space, and something that we will try to overcome in encouraging people to interact with the objects. We have taboos against touching operating in society that very much permeate condition the way we engage an event like an art viewing.
I might, just from to me, what's fascinating about what you'll see tonight is the walls that you'll kind of move up against and start to touch and put your ear to and really engage that wall. I think that again goes back to an invitation to have a relationship or think about buildings in a completely different way than I think. Typically we think of them as objects and things that are separate from ourselves. And I think there's really, I think that's a very detrimental way for all of us to think about the spaces that we inhabit, because that distance is, I think, sort of at the core of why we even have a sustainability problem in the first place, because we in essence have sort of lost touch with the very thing that we create to surround ourselves with. A building is much like a shell is to a mollusk. How this building shares and embraces my body, it also embraces all of you. And that kind of shared embrace, to me, is what I started to think a lot about when I'm listening to that wall and hearing the weather that's taking place somewhere else. So that, I think, looking at that as an invitation, and then over time, how that touch will probably soil that wall. I think that to me is going to be really interesting to come back at the end of the display and begin to see the markings of what got left, and that kind of palimpsest that wall will take on over time is also something that's very interesting and invites us to think about the life of a building and how buildings age just like we age, and that there's grace to that. And that's what I'm hoping we as architects will start to pay more attention to, rather than what it simply looks like as an object.
And Hansel and I have had some conversations about what are elements of building design today, because he specializes in kind of creating spaces that are optimal for deaf and hard of hearing. And my interests in accessibility and universal design talk about using the building and giving clues for primarily Navigation, that's always the biggest challenge for blind and visually impaired, but lately I've also thought about sound and sound absorption and sound reflection and how that works in a building, and lighting as well. I mean, good lighting in a building is incredibly important to someone who has low vision and can utilize that vision. It's also important to someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, because the better the lighting is, the better they're going to perceive the environment they're in when they can't hear. So we've had some conversations about shared environmental aspects of design that really touch each other and complement each other in a way that makes a building even more universally usable for all.
Right.
And to make the walls even like friendlier to snuggle up against or put your ear to, we painted them with milk paint. So that like even just an hour after painting it, there aren't any of those noxious fumes that you associate with other paints. So it's a very subtle intervention, but it makes a difference in that moment.
Now, when you press your ear up against the wall, you'll hear, again, the live sounds from outdoors, the weather report, and the Beaufort wind scale. And so you're really bringing kind of weather and the climate into the gallery. Why weather? Why this interest in weather and the climate?
I was telling Yukio that I just spent the last year living in Glasgow, Scotland, and everyone talks about the weather all the time. And it's a big part of living in Scotland is the weather, and it's not like always a bad thing. It's like it's what you talk about. And if it was sunny for 5 days, on the 6th day, everyone talks about what a relief it is that the air feels fresh because there's it's raining. And so I was thinking a lot about weather, and also listening to the BBC. They have the shipping forecast, which is this old forecast that and people like go to sleep listening to it. It's a much loved forecast.
Yeah.
And they use the Beaufort wind scale in the shipping forecast. So I think we became interested in that. But I'm also interested in what is the climate or the atmosphere for these houses. And so it's the weather, both, and bringing it in from outdoors and creating its own sort of climate within the space.
Yeah. To build on that, I think one of the things that is also interesting is again how contemporary that commentary is, or positioning weather and buildings is going back to this idea. The building is sort of a skin, if you will. As we've matured into the whole era of sustainability, we now have buildings where windows don't necessarily open. Mechanical systems are driving the temperature of the room. Oftentimes acoustics. This room actually has really wonderful acoustics. Many times it's hard to hear a speaker or hard to hear yourself think because of the mechanical systems are designed poorly. We're completely separated from that weather. So, and somehow weather's become a bad thing to be in a building or to have that permeable skin. In the deaf community, what that meant was older buildings before there was the existence of air conditioning systems or lighting, buildings were much more attuned to borrowing those natural systems, be it light or wind or even temperature. And those then gave buildings a much more kind of navigatability. They gave them the quality of light was much better for reading sign language. We lost all of that when we began to introduce electric light and air conditioning into buildings. Even room dimensions, hallways were much wider for the circulation and stratification of air. All of that changed as we began to shrink buildings, largely for control of temperature. So I think seeing these together and seeing how weather is our friend, like in Scotland, rainy is good. I think there's a real lesson to learn there about how we think about our environment and where we think about our own membrane is. Is it another sweater? Is it a building? So I think, again, your work is really an invitation to think about buildings in a really wonderfully new way.
Or going back, it's going back in time to
Yeah.
the Howe building, which is
Yeah,
the
right.
main building on the Perkins campus, where there's these two long colonnades, and along them there's windows. So in the summertime, they're originally all open, so that as you walk down the colonnade, you'd feel the breeze on one cheek, and so it would orient you. You know where you are. And I don't know if they're still open in the summer. If they
Yes, they still are.
good.
We just finished a renovation project on one end of the Howe building to modernize it a little bit and make it more wheelchair accessible. But that portion of the building is still very much high windows and very thick walls to keep the cool, the cool in and the heat out in the summer and vice versa. So there's still a lot of the 100-plus-year-old architecture that lives on every day.
When I was in Ohio talking with Celia at the Ohio State School for the Blind, she commented that in one of the classrooms they'd rebuilt the windows are really high, and so the children who were blind had no idea what the weather was outside, and they'd have to ask her, well, what's going on outside, and so it seemed really important to bring the weather in.
Well, it's really, I mean, one of the interesting things about the show is the equivalence you make between the models and the gallery itself. And of course, that's underscored by the fact that one of the models in the show is of the Johnson-Kulukundis gallery, which you yourself made, but which kind of leads me back to the models. And just wanted to ask, when you encountered the models, well, I guess this is a question for all of you. What went into the selection process? I guess could you tell us a little bit about more about your fascination with the models?
Well, when you first invited me to do something here, I wanted to reproduce the Howe building at Radcliffe, and I it was not practical, so I couldn't do it. So then I sort of revisited our visit, Hansel's and my visit, and going down into that Tactile museum, and I was thinking I just wanted to make a kind of cabinet of curiosities here, but it was really the buildings which were of interest, and then. When Lily discovered that there's this whole cache of them in Ohio, then that got really exciting. And so there's a lot of them in Ohio, dozens, but they're all in storage. And so we chose the ones which were the most travelable, which were in the best condition, and also to have sort of a range of monuments and then more and domestic buildings.
Well, you've given them a wonderful kind of new chapter in their afterlife. And Kim, could you say a little bit more about the kind of the history of the pedagogical use of the models? And architectural models are really, tactile models are a really fascinating way of understanding architecture and scale. And
They absolutely are, and I can remember the first time I actually got to look at one of the WPA models at Perkins. Because I didn't go to Perkins as a student. I went to another school for the blind in another state, and always wished while I was in school that someday I could go to Perkins, never knowing that one day I was going to get a degree in library science and become the director of the library at Perkins. So it was kind of a wonderful story, but touching the models and just knowing the story of the WPA and the craftsmen of the era, that pulling those people together to create such beautiful models, and that's what you'll get to experience when you go to the gallery. But it's so meaningful because the Parthenon, for example, is a very huge building and very challenging to describe. So I've always known that models played a very important role in teaching blind and visually impaired kids. Most of the time it had been used for animals and things like that, but having buildings, cathedrals, bridges is another thing that we have several bridge models at Perkins, because we've got a bridge right here in town that isn't all that old, the Zakum Bridge. How do you describe the Zakum Bridge to somebody who has never how do you touch a bridge? You don't touch a bridge, you need a model. And my other model experience was the space shuttle. I lost my vision when I was 11, and so that was before there was a space shuttle. I knew it was some kind of little, machine thing that had these big wheels and things like that, but I didn't really know what it did until I saw a model at Perkins. So even, these models are phenomenally beautiful. They're carved, they're art in themselves, but even a plastic model can convey so much information. And using them rockets, and like you said, you saw a rocket in the Tactile Museum. They really bring home what an object is and how it works by having that opportunity to feel the whole dimension of the object or the building.
One of the interesting things about the models that we discussed when we had a walkthrough earlier was how it conveys scale and texture, which is interesting because Hansel, as you mentioned, some of those wood components, if they were scaled up properly, would be enormous pieces of wood
right.
in relation to.
Yeah, I find their craftsmanship just really compelling because of that play on scale. Some of the houses are made out of plywood that we build our houses with. So you'll have this grain in this wood grain in this house that would be, a strand of wood would be as big as my body, or a little nail might be the size of this table. And there's just some way in the craftsmanship that all of that comes together, that it really shows the hand in the making. And so in some ways I find that one of the most beautiful parts of the model is you see their making. And I think that's another way that this idea of touch, it touches through time that way. And I think that I find them really beautiful that way. You'll notice some of the models also will have some variation in color. And I think that, this is my own suspicion, but I think that was the craftsmen who are looking at the idea of high contrast of color for people who are low vision, to begin to discern certain building types or parts. So they're playing with that, as well as texture, the way they play in light. On the idea of scale, I think, I'm certain I'm wrong about this, but I'm going to say it anyway. You'll see that the Capitol building is in there, and then the Washington Monument, and they're almost close enough in scale that you could probably set them up in the room and see the relationship between those two in a way that would help you understand our national monument in a way that you don't really when you're there. And this is a place I see every day living in Washington, D.C. So I think those elements that we're not accustomed to looking at, these models really show that really beautifully.
There's a part of the exhibit that I want to be sure people don't miss, because it's not really a model, but it is. And it's outside of the exhibit hall itself. So gonna make sure you see outside the window of the exhibit hall when you're there, the trees on the wall. They were made by the WPA, they're labeled in Braille, and they are different tree species in a two-dimensional replica that made of wood on the walls. So they're kind of fun because, again, think about trees. Even when you climb a tree as a blind kid, you're not going to get the full sense of the shape of the tree. So there's one particular tree on that wall that I told my colleagues here, I had no idea what a poplar tree looked like. So go look at a poplar tree and you'll see why I was so mystified at what it looked like when I touched it today.
And they have small figures carved in the bases of the trunks to give
Yes,
you a sense
that
of scale.
represent a person, so
of-
you can see the scale with the little person at the bottom, you can feel it.
And the models are decidedly not architectural models.
Yeah.
And I was talking with Hansel about this, being an architect, but architectural models are made to sell an idea to a client, and these are not made to sell an idea to a client. They're made to be touched and to be handled, and so in some ways they resemble dollhouses a little bit more than they would an architectural model.
Yeah, and I reminded Wendy that one of the travesties, I think, certainly in architectural education when I went to school, is learning how to make models, one of the first things they tell you is you're not making a dollhouse. You know, this is about architecture, it's about the concept. And I think we talked about that earlier this afternoon, and it just now kind of dawned on me. Again, here, that's kind of like, you know, teaching children not to draw, you know, these, to be creative, you know, draw, color between the lines kind of idea. And I think there again, there's, embedded in our educational system is this idea that you shouldn't touch.
Right.
You know, you shouldn't make models that you want to break or touch. So I think this idea of going back and rebuilding dollhouses is, I think we should reintroduce that in architecture school.
Yeah, the models certainly look like they're, as you said, they're meant to be touched.
Yeah,
And
very
that's
much
really,
so.
Wendy, why you wanted to make your own model, rather than commission someone else to make it.
Right,
Yeah.
at first Megan had offered that, you know, the architectural firm that designed the space, maybe they could make the model. And so I went to visit their offices and looked at their models, and there's like, no, they were not meant, it was a completely different, everything, different style.
Well, it's not quite architecture, but there's this wonderful anecdote, Kim, that you told about how tactile engagement helps to kind of allow one to know an object, and it concerns one of your trips to, I believe it was Hawaii, you said, when you were given a
yes,
tour of a ship.
yes.
And I was wondering if you could kind of just relay that
Oh,
anecdote. 'cause I
I'd
think
love
it's
to
very-
share that story.
Very pertinent to what
My-
we're talking about here.
Husband and I, my husband's in the front row here, and we were traveling in Hawaii, and we were with a man who had been very much involved in bringing the USS Missouri to Honolulu as a permanent museum for World War II. And he took us on a tour of the ship and showed us a lot of different things. And we were on the main deck, and he said, you know, the kamikazes would crash their planes into the side of the battleships, trying to sink them. And that there was a place on the Missouri where you could, you know, where that had happened. And I asked how far down from the deck it was, and he said it's about 12 inches down. And so I said, can I touch it? And he said, well, sure. So I got down on the ground and put my hand over the edge and felt the dent in the side of this battleship that I was on. And it was, you know, it brought it to life for me. But what really brought it to life was when I stood up, I said to him, have you ever touched that? And he goes, no, I haven't. I said, well, do it. And he got down on his knees and he felt it. And he sounded like he had tears in his eyes when he stood up. He said, I've been on this ship dozens of times and I never did that. And that meant so much to me. So there's just that whole extra level of the sense of touch and what it can bring to the occasion.
This is so interesting. I mean, one of the things that is, I think, really, you know, again, kind of permeates the exhibition is this relationship between language and the other senses, and tactility in particular. And it's both manifest in the Beaufort wind scale and the relationship between verbal description and visual description, but also in the very handouts and postcards for the show, which are printed in Braille as well. It was something I think we were talking about earlier, but it's something I think that has been was particularly important for us to do for the show. Wendy, could you elaborate a little bit on?
Well, for the card for the show, it was really important that this be something that could be read by someone who read Braille as well as by someone who read Roman letters. And so the Braille is superimposed or printed right on top of the other, and so it can be read equally. And I just love that sort of simultaneous translation, one right on top of the other, and neither one interrupts the other.
And even for those of us who don't read Braille, it's kind of a very kind of a appealing, kind of moving thing to be able to feel it in our hands.
Right.
Resensitizes us to our fingertips as kind of.
You just hold the
sensory-
card and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, there's something different, yeah.
Sensory objects. Well, we're pretty much out of time for the panel, so what I wanted to do was now invite everybody again with us to move to the neighboring Byerly Hall to join us for a viewing of the show and the reception. But before that, to join me in thanking our panelists and the artists.